AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon, our first Tuesday afternoon visit with Patrick Coolican of the year 2024. Patrick, of course, is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. As each Tuesday we chat about some of the stories that they've been working on and the latest in Minnesota news and politics, as we have no shortage of topics to talk about today, including Patrick's column on the Minnesota Republican congressional delegation, not exactly showing a lot of spine. We'll also be talking about Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, suing a dairy farm for wage theft, and we'll be talking about how Minnesota is number one in a category that probably won't exactly thrill Republicans. So let's get to things, though. Patrick, how are you doing today? Thanks for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, let's start off talking about your column on our Minnesota Republican congressional delegation, because all four of them, probably to no one's surprise, have decided to endorse Donald Trump for president. Let's first talk about what exactly the position is of all four of our Congress people on Donald Trump, because, well, Tom Emmer's stance is especially interesting, being that, well, Donald Trump has been criticizing him a lot in the past, including calling him a rhino, but lo and behold, all four of our Congress people well on board with the Trump train here in 2024.
Yeah, Tom Emmer was actually a somewhat early endorser back in the 2016 campaign, I think reflecting his 6th district constituency, who were big fans of Donald Trump. But after the 2020 election, Emmer voted to ratify the results of the election that made Joe Biden president, and he kind of laid out his position as to why he did so. And of course, Trump is known to have a long memory, and he never forgets a slight. And so when Emmer made his very short-lived effort to become Speaker of the U.S. House during the fall chaos and the House Republican Conference, Trump came out hard against Emmer, as you said, called him a globalist rhino, which I guess is about the worst thing you can be called in the Republican Party these days. And probably the resistance from Trump probably ultimately prevented Emmer from becoming Speaker. And yet Emmer turns around now a few months later and endorses Trump to be the nominee before we've even started the contest, and then of course to be president. I'm less surprised by Michelle Fischbach. She did not vote to ratify the 2020 election results. She seems to have gone full Kool-Aid out there. I knew her when she was in the state Senate. She seemed like a pretty reasonable person to me. But I guess it's maybe different when you go to Washington. And remember, she was on Fox News shortly after the 2020 election, saying that they were just quote unquote finding votes to give to Joe Biden, when in fact they were just counting votes. And so that was a particularly egregious smear of the election administration folks in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But the other two guys from the 1st and the 8th district, I think they probably just kind of go along with what Emmer says. And so we're left with this conundrum of Tom Emmer, the supposed constitutional conservative, who said after that 2020 election, in the middle of the big lie and the attempted coup, that as he said in his letter, that the events of January 6th were an unacceptable display of violence that runs counter to everything we stand for as a country, and also said that Congress does not have the authority to discard an individual slate of electors certified by a state's legislature in accordance with their constitution. So in other words, he hated January 6th. He didn't think that Congress could overturn the election results as Trump wanted them to do. And yet here he is turning around just 3 years later and saying Trump should be president. And so it just, to me, it's an outrageous lack of any kind of political courage on his part.
Well, I think as we take a look at the congressional delegation of our Minnesota Republicans, to me, and this is my opinion, I think they represent the exact problem of what we have in the Republican Party right now, where it's easy to obviously go and blame the extremists, whether it's Lauren Boebert or Louis Gohmert or whoever else. But to me, I think the people like Tom Emmer, or even if we look nationally at like Susan Collins, Lindsey Graham, or even Bill Barr, I think these types of Republicans are really the problem that, well, essentially are just going to open the door to a despot when you see people like, as we were talking about, Tom Emmer or even Michelle Fischbach, people who, as you were talking about, seemed relatively reasonable back when they were in the state legislature and before they came into the national spotlight. They seem to know what exactly the right thing is, but, well, here they are, as Donald Trump says, bending the knee exactly when it counts, and that's largely all four of our Congress people here in Minnesota. I guess maybe besides Finstad, simply because we just simply don't know a whole lot about him. But Emmer, Fischbach, and Pete Stauber all seem to kind of be in that cloth of being, well, more establishment Republicans, but at the end of the day, they'll always still go to Trump no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, somebody, or Mitch McConnell is the best example, or Paul Ryan. They know better, and you hear all these accounts out of Washington reporting about how people will say on background or off the record that they all make fun of Trump, and they say he's the worst, and yet they can never stand up to him because it'll be the end of their political career, and becoming irrelevant is the scariest thought for so many politicians. And you mentioned the bend the knee thing, and so it was really humiliating, I think, not just for Emmer, but for the people of the 6th District that who he represents, when the New York Times reports on Friday that Trump keeps very close track of who is endorsing him, and he especially likes it when anybody who has crossed him before has now endorsed him. And the quote that he apparently said to somebody was, "They always bend the knee," and that's what we have seen time and again since he became the leader of the Republican Party in 2016, and it's really demoralizing, I think, for anybody who's a small d Democrat, anybody who believes in a constitutional republic, and not a despot, the word that I used in my column and that you used as well, because that's the path that we're on when a guy can go to extra legal means to try to retain his grip on power after the voters have rejected him, and then use a violent mob. That's the direction we're moving if he were to be reinstalled as president.
Well, you can read more about that column over at minnesotareformer.com. Minnesotareformer.com. Encourage you to check it out because, yeah, as we were talking about, we have, well, 4 Republican Congress people here in Minnesota who don't exactly have the strongest of spines. And it's just interesting that, yeah, none of the 4 are like the Lauren Boeberts or Louis Gohmerts, but also on the other side, they're not like Mitt Romney or even Liz Cheney or former Representative Adam Kinzinger. They're just kind of that GOP establishment that will go along with Trump no matter what. So make sure you go check out that column, minnesotareformer.com. Let's go ahead and talk about some wage theft cases here in Minnesota, because there is a Minnesota dairy farm that is facing a $3 million wage theft lawsuit that involved hundreds of immigrant workers in Minnesota. This is Max Nestorak reporting, saying that Attorney General Keith Ellison filed one of the largest wage theft cases in the office's history yesterday against Evergreen Acres Dairy, alleging that the company robbed hundreds of immigrant workers of at least $3 million in wages while taking even more from their paychecks, and while largely putting them in very overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, to say the least. So let's talk a little bit about some of the conditions that these workers face, because these are just absolutely atrocious, whether it's shaving hours, having no payments for their first few weeks on the job, or having very substandard housing. This is straight out of, well, kind of your worst case scenario of what like we used to have our workers treated like during the Gilded Age. This is a pretty ugly situation from what I've read.
Yeah, the details of the complaint are shocking, and outrageous. As Max reports, that the dairy owners regularly took 12 to 32 hours out of each 2-week paycheck. They didn't pay overtime. They would also not be paid for the first 2 weeks they worked, and often not receive their final paycheck. They also would charge rent to keep these workers in really ugly conditions. For instance, they might have to share a bed so that somebody would go do a 12-hour shift, and then they would come back, and then they would swap out with somebody, and the person who was resting during the day would then go out and do the 12-hour night shift. They're sharing a bed. They lived in garages and barns and other buildings that were clearly unfit for humans, and lots of mold. In some cases, they lived in buildings without toilets, and then there was a lot of threats involved. This is all according to the complaint brought by Attorney General Keith Ellison. A lot of these workers are undocumented immigrants. Thankfully, there's a Biden administration rule that allows them to help on an investigation without having to worry about deportation. But really a shocking set of alleged facts here, and I think it really should clarify for folks the how much it matters to have somebody in the Attorney General's office who cares about this issue of wage theft. If we're gonna get people for knocking over a liquor store, we ought to be interested in going after folks who are just outright stealing money from workers. And so I think it shows how important the Office of Attorney General is.
Yeah, and just to even piggyback on that point even more, as we talked about, many of these workers were immigrants who probably are very hesitant to go to law enforcement and report that, well, we're living in these horrible, illegal conditions with our housing or our wages are being stolen. That's a little intimidating to do as an immigrant. As someone who's very freshly new to the country, doesn't want to lose their job or risk deportation. That's why you need the role of someone like an attorney general who can fight on behalf of people who generally might be a little bit more nervous about doing that type of thing.
Right, and you can imagine a certain kind of Republican attorney general essentially telling these workers to pound sand, and whether or not by default or not, just protecting an employer who is exploiting workers like this, because they don't they're not willing to listen to the stories of immigrants who are undocumented.
We'll read more about the report that Max wrote over MinnesotaReformer.com, titled Minnesota Dairy Farm Faces $3 Million Wage Theft Lawsuit Involving Hundreds of Workers. Well, one last story I wanted to talk to you about has to do with the fact that we're number one. Well, not exactly in a category that Republicans are thrilled about, because we're number one in having the highest corporate tax rate in the country at 9.8%, as we recently beat out New Jersey. So naturally, as you would think, companies must be fleeing Minnesota, and we must be having terrible economic conditions with a high employment rate, businesses fleeing. Well, turns out that's not the case, as we have, well, one of the lowest employment rates in the country, unemployment rates, I should say, in the entire country. Don't want to mix that up, while also having one of the strongest economies in the country. So my question for you, what are your thoughts on this overall report showing that we have the highest corporate tax rate in the country, but lo and behold, we still have pretty healthy economic conditions and an overall pretty high quality of life here in our state?
Yeah, I've lived in a place in Nevada. I was a reporter there for 7 years, and it was famous as a tax haven. Also famous for being a pretty terrible place to live, especially if you were sick or a child or in need of any kind of specialty health or mental health care.
Sounds like basically if you were a human without being a millionaire, yeah, you might have been.
Yeah, exactly. If you didn't have a car, I mean, it was. The taxes are the price we pay for civilization, and our robust tax system here has created a great, for a lot of people anyway, good schools, health care, parks, and other amenities. The problem is that we haven't reached everyone, and that's the ongoing project here in Minnesota, and certainly what we're focused on with the Reformer. But Those, insofar as we have a pretty good quality of life here, and you can see that in all kinds of different metrics, like starting with life expectancy, but also incomes and homeownership, and as you said, the unemployment rate. That's in large part, or at least in part, due to the fact that we have the resources to make it happen. And not only that, but there's a new report out today. We talked about before we got on the air here by a national nonprofit that ranks states by tax progressivity. In other words, what share of income do poor people versus rich people pay? And Minnesota has the most progressive tax system in the country, which isn't saying much because most states have very regressive tax systems that rely too much on sales tax. But one of the reasons that we're progressive is that we actually force corporations to pay something close to their fair share, and so that helps our tax progressivity. So not only do we have all these this robust government sector that provides pretty decent schools and healthcare, social services, transportation, et cetera, but we do it in a way that isn't quite so harmful to working class people. So they're not shelling out tons of money when they go to Target to pay for those services. So it works on both ends, at least in my view.
Well, I like that measurement you were talking about, too. Not just looking at, so often when we compare tax rates from state to state, we always look at, well, what's the overall rate? I like that measurement of, well, looking at tax fairness, because that's a much better measurement than just looking at the overall tax rate, because as we were just talking about for the past few minutes, that's not necessarily a predictor of, well, the quality of life in a state.
Yeah, and there's another issue on this idea of I think a lot of Republicans would like us to be some kind of a tax haven, like Nevada or South Dakota, North Dakota. What type of people and companies do you attract when you are advertise yourself or market yourself as a tax haven? I'll be honest, they're just not the kind of companies that, with any kind of social ethic at all, or they tend to be people who are almost solely focused on the bottom line. And I don't know that that's really even the kinds of people or companies that we want to attract here.
Yeah, I would agree in that it would be tough to even try to compete with a state like North Dakota or South Dakota on their tax rates, simply because you'd have to pretty much cut things to the bone to even try to be competitive with them when they've been established as tax havens for so long. Well,
that's a key point. Yeah. Is that why should we go into that race that we're never going to win? And so what we need to do is market ourselves as a place with a really high quality of life where, yeah, you pay for it, but in all these different measures, we offer a better quality of life for more people.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like even if you wanted to become that tax haven, it would take decades to even start competing with a state like North and South Dakota, because they've had such a head start on it. It would take a long, long time, and in the long run, probably wouldn't even be worth it in the first place as well. Well, you've been speaking with Patrick Coolican. He is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com to read more about the stories we talked about, as well as the latest in Minnesota news and politics, again, over at minnesotareformer.com. Patrick, as always, thanks for coming on the show today. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.